He does not stand at the balcony. He does not wave to crowds. No smoke rises when he is chosen. No choir sings his name. He does not wear white. And yet, within the marble veins of the Vatican, his presence is unmistakable, his silence more commanding than any sermon. They call him the Black Pope, not because of his soul, but because of his robes, dark, unadorned, a shadow that walks just behind the throne. His real title is Superior General of the Society of Jesus, but titles like robes are often designed to conceal. He's not elected by cardinals, not chosen with pomp or bells. His selection happens behind closed doors, among brothers of the order, men bound not just by vows, but by something older, deeper, obedience. Total, absolute, unchallenged obedience. To whom? That's where things begin to blur. Because the Black Pope does not kneel before thrones, he sits beside them, advises them, and some say, guides them, not with decree, but with influence, with networks, with a knowledge that stretches centuries deep. The public sees the white Pope, the smiling figurehead, the man in white waving from the window over St. Peter's Square. But the ex-priest said this: the man in white changes. The man in black continues. The Jesuits were never just priests. They were thinkers, educators, advisors to kings, confessors to emperors, missionaries with maps long before satellites, and at the head of them all, the superior general, the man in the shadows, the architect behind the altar. He commands no army, he wields no sword, but his reach wraps around the globe. Every Jesuit school, every mission, every whisper of confession flows back to him, and through him to Rome. He is not merely a religious leader, he is a strategist, a historian, a guardian of secrets that never make it into scripture. Why is his name so rarely spoken? Perhaps because to name a shadow is to invite it into the light, and the Church has always understood that some power works better unseen. There have been whispers, of course, that the Black Pope holds more sway than the white, that behind every papal decree is a Jesuit council, that when doctrines shift it is not the Vatican bureaucracy, but the Society of Jesus pulling the threads. But these are only whispers, echoes behind the stone, yet in every papal reign you will find his fingerprints, subtle, precise, indelible, and if you trace them far enough through corridors of diplomacy, through educational systems, through the intricate machinery of belief, you arrive not at a chapel but at a command center, one built not for worship, but for governance. The Black Pope does not seek followers. He seeks order, alignment, continuity in a church that outlives kings, nations, even truth itself. He is not a villain, he is not a saint, he is something else, necessary, invisible, and utterly central. So while the crowds chant for the man in white, while cameras flash and choirs rise, remember this: power doesn't always stand in the spotlight. Sometimes it waits in the shadow beside the throne, and sometimes the one not waving is the one pulling the strings. They were not born from peace. The Jesuits emerged in a time of fire, a church under siege, a world splitting at the seams. It was the 16th century. Protestantism had fractured the old order. Luther's hammer had struck the door and Rome's foundation trembled. And then came Ignatius, a soldier, wounded in body but sharpened in spirit. He formed a new kind of priest, not monks cloistered in stone, but missionaries armed with reason, rhetoric, and relentless obedience. The Society of Jesus. Not a gentle name, not a gentle mission. They were built for counterattack, for precision, for persuasion, for war, of the mind, and sometimes of the soul. But at the center of it all was one rule: obedience, not mild compliance, not respectful disagreement, total, immediate, unquestioning, perindiasi cadaver. Like a corpse, that's how a Jesuit was to obey. Not to think, not to interpret, but to move only when commanded, like a dead man in the hands of his superiors. That was the standard. And to whom was this obedience owed? First to their superior, then to the superior general, and ultimately to the Pope. But over time, the lines blurred. Because while the white pope ruled from the chair of Peter, the Jesuits answered to their own. The man in black, the general, and his authority. It wasn't symbolic. He could assign missions, remove priests, command silence, demand action, anywhere in the world. Jesuits were sent into the most dangerous territories, China, Japan, the Ottoman courts, hidden among enemies, disguised, entrusted with conversion or information. They learned languages, mapped cultures, studied philosophies not to oppose but to absorb. And yet, no matter how far they travelled, they carried the same vow, to obey unto death. The ex-priest once said it wasn't faith that held the Jesuits together, it was structure. A network so disciplined that it could pass messages across empires faster than kings. And behind that structure was loyalty, not to God, not to Rome, but to the order itself. The Pope may have sat on the throne, but the Jesuits moved like a separate nervous system, connected, alert, loyal inward before loyal upward. So who do they serve? That's the question few ever ask. Because to serve the church is simple, but to serve a structure that serves the church in secret, in silence, is something else entirely. The Jesuits became confessors to monarchs, tutors to heirs, architects of doctrine, and at every level obedience remained unchallenged. Even today a Jesuit priest is taught that his will is not his own. His thoughts may be examined, his movements redirected, and if his superior general calls, he answers, without delay, without hesitation, even if it means exile, even if it means silence. Especially if it means silence, because power, true power, isn't loud, it's disciplined, precise, invisible. And the Society of Jesus was built to wield it in the name of something far greater than any one man. So yes, they are priests, but they are also instruments. And the question remains, instruments of what? Of faith? Of doctrine? Or of a deeper, older command that answers to no throne at all? Perhaps the Black Pope holds that answer, and perhaps that's why he stays so very quiet. It's whispered in forums, posted on old conspiracy websites, spoken of with reverence by some and discussed by others. The Jesuit oath, not the public one, not the solemn vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. Those are well known, documented, ceremonial. But this other oath, it hides in the shadows. Passed like forbidden scripture from one generation of doubters to the next, claimed to have been read aloud in secret chambers, sworn in blood, bound by fear. It speaks of infiltration, of disguises, of pledges to destroy from within, to act like one of the flock until the moment strikes, to control, subvert, neutralize, to lie if necessary, to kill if commanded. It reads like fiction, too theatrical, too bold, too convenient for those who need a villain in a collar, and yet it won't go away. The Church denies it, loudly, officially, always. Historians dismiss it, label it a forgery, trace back to anti-Catholic propaganda in Protestant England in 17th century pamphlets designed to incite fear. And perhaps that's all it is, a myth, a mirror reflecting suspicion more than truth. But even mirrors show something. Why does this oath resurface again and again? Why has it endured when other lies fade into dust? The ex-priest never confirmed its existence, but he didn't laugh it off either. He said, "There are truths in fiction that can't be spoken in fact." He said the real oath, if it exists, would never be printed, would never be archived. It would live only in the eyes of those who took it, in their silence, in their discipline, in the way they obey without hesitation. Because an oath doesn't need to be read to be real. Sometimes it's passed in posture, in legacy, in the understanding that what is spoken aloud is only the beginning, and what is understood without being said is the real bond. The rumoured Jesuit oath is theatrical, yes, dramatic, violent even. But if it's a lie, it's a strange one, crafted not to mock but to warn. It paints a picture of an organisation that stops at nothing, that infiltrates governments, influences nations, silences opposition with a smile. And while there's no proof of such an oath being sworn, there is proof of Jesuit influence that spans centuries, of kings counselled, wars whispered into motion, ideas suppressed not by sword but by silence. So maybe the question isn't, did they say these words? Maybe the question is, why does it feel like they did? Because sometimes what we sense echoing in history is stronger than anything written on paper. And sometimes a forbidden oath becomes believable not because it was ever uttered, but because its spirit has already moved through the world, through corridors of power, through pages of rewritten history, through the subtle control of what we're taught to see and what we're told to ignore. Fact or fiction, the oath still breathes, in rumour, in fear, in the edges of belief that the society of Jesus was never just about salvation, but about something far more strategic, and perhaps far more dangerous, because when silence is sacred and obedience is absolute, an oath doesn't need words to be binding, and it just needs a purpose, and someone willing to keep it. He is not crowned, there is no white smoke, no thunderous bells ringing across the Tiber, no massive crowd fills the square, no televised spectacle, no waving from balconies. His name is not shouted, it is recorded, quietly, internally, among brothers who already knew who he was long before the vote was cast. He is the superior general, head of the Society of Jesus, the man they call the Black Pope. But don't let the lack of ceremony fool you. His power is immense, his reach unmatched, and the process that selects him is anything but ordinary. It begins within. No cardinals, no papal blessing, only Jesuits, only those who have lived the vows, walked the missions, breathed the rhythm of the order. They gather in what's called a general congregation, not once a year, not even once a decade, only when needed. Only when leadership must be chosen or replaced. It is one of the most secretive elections in the world. No outside influence, no political pressure, only deep discernment among men who understand the weight of what's at stake. The general must be many things: a theologian, a strategist, a global thinker who understands faith and power in equal measure. But above all, he must inspire absolute obedience, not through fear, but through conviction. Because Jesuits do not obey lightly, they obey completely, and once elected, the superior general serves for life. No term limit, no resignation, unless forced by extraordinary circumstances. He is not a bishop. He does not wear the papal ring, but he commands over 15,000 Jesuits in more than 100 countries, educators, scientists, missionaries, priests who sit at the tables of presidents and whisper in the ears of kings. All of them, without exception, answer to him, not to the Vatican, to him. And in that chain of command lies a subtle shift. Because while the white pope governs publicly, the black pope governs with precision. He does not issue encyclicals, he issues instructions. He does not speak to the world, he speaks to those who shape it. And slowly, quietly, his influence filters through seminaries, universities, parishes and pulpits, until it arrives not as a command, but as common belief. The ex-priest said the general is more than a leader. He is the keeper of strategy. He decides where the society expands, which missions are prioritized, which ideas are worth pursuing and which are not. And because Jesuits are embedded everywhere, his decisions ripple far beyond religion, into politics, into science, into the very frameworks of how the world understands itself. So while the white pope stands as a shepherd to the faithful, the black pope moves like a conductor, behind the curtain, beneath the music, shaping what is heard without ever being seen. There is no pageantry in his office, no crown, just a desk, a seal, and the knowledge that his authority is absolute within the society, and that society is global. So next time the camera turns to St. Peter's Square and the Pope offers his blessing, ask yourself, whose vision shaped the words, whose strategy placed him there, and who, without ever being seen, continues to pull the threads from the deepest chambers of the Church itself? Because the Black Pope may not need the spotlight when he already owns the stage. The world sees one Pope, dressed in white, standing before crowds, waving from balconies, a voice of peace, of doctrine, of continuity. But behind the scenes another figure moves, also a Pope, in all but name, the Black Pope, the Superior General. Together they form a strange symmetry, two men, two missions, two centers of gravity, orbiting the same holy empire, one in the light, one in the shadow. It's not a rivalry, it's not even conflict, it's a choreography, and most never notice the steps. The white pope leads the flock. He speaks in blessings, issues encyclicals, smiles for cameras. He is the symbol, the shepherd. But the black pope, he organizes the shepherds, he trains them, sends them, shapes them before they ever reach a pulpit. He builds the systems, refines the language, directs the narrative long before it reaches the Vatican press office. And his reach is quiet, precise, global. Because while the Pope governs the Church, the Superior General governs its most loyal arm, the Jesuits. And the Jesuits govern influence. They teach the elite. They advise the powerful. They infiltrate not with force, but with brilliance. And behind them, the Black Pope watches, listens, coordinates. It's not a conspiracy, it's structure. The White Pope rules the stage, the Black Pope writes the script. The ex-priest used to say this wasn't deception, it was survival. For an institution that has outlived empires, revolutions, and reformations, power must be layered, compartmentalized, distributed across thrones you can't see. Because one man alone can't hold it all, not openly, not safely, and so the Church built a dual system, one for the faithful, one for the architects, one visible, one hidden, and in between, a wall of silence, a line rarely crossed, but always known. Pope Francis is the first Jesuit to sit on Peter's throne, and some said it was the end of the division, that Jesuit thinking had finally come fully into the light, but others knew better. The Black Pope still exists, still commands, still operates separately, strategically, because even when a Jesuit becomes Pope, the structure doesn't collapse, it expands, it deepens. Two popes, two centers of command, but one church, one mission, one body with two minds, and the faithful are never told which one is truly steering. Because it doesn't matter. Not when the outcomes remain the same, not when doctrine bends slowly in the direction the society always intended. So while the White Pope blesses the world, the Black Pope arranges it, not with fanfare, not with sermons, but with networks, with strategies, with silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any homily ever could. Two popes, one power, and only one was ever meant to be seen. They didn't need armies, they didn't need flags. They built their empire in silence. Not on battlefields, but in classrooms. Not with weapons, but with books, with chalk, with language. From the very beginning, the Jesuits understood something others missed, that the most enduring form of power is not control, but influence. And influence begins with the mind, so they built schools, universities, institutions of unmatched rigor, discipline, and prestige. Not for the poor, not at first, but for the elite, the future leaders, the sons of kings and governors, the heirs to wealth and rule. They weren't just educating, they were shaping, planting ideas that would take decades to bloom, ideas cloaked in reason, faith, philosophy, and always loyalty, loyalty to the order, loyalty to the unseen structure that guided it. By the 17th century, Jesuit colleges dotted Europe, Paris, Rome, Vienna, Madrid. By the 18th, they had crossed oceans, Asia, Africa, the Americas. Wherever a throne stood, a Jesuit advisor stood behind it, quiet, educated, trusted. They learned every language, mastered every culture, translated ideas between civilizations long before diplomats ever arrived. They were missionaries, yes, but also scholars, scientists, linguists, strategists. And the world listened, because Jesuit education was second to none. It still is. Georgetown, Fordham, Loyola, Boston College. The most prestigious minds in politics, finance, media, law. Many passed through Jesuit halls. They learned to think sharply, debate respectfully, conform without realizing, not indoctrination, persuasion. That's the Jesuit gift. The ex-priest once said, Jesuits don't teach you what to think, they teach you how to think in a way that always leads back to them. And it worked, because those who passed through didn't leave the order. They carried it with them, into courtrooms, boardrooms, capitals. Jesuit-trained minds rose to lead nations, command corporations, shape narratives, and behind them, a network. Not official, not public, but real. A brotherhood bound by shared formation, a memory of old halls and older books, a quiet understanding of who helped them ascend. And then there's the money. Jesuit schools are not free. They are well funded, endowed, supported by donors who believe in what the order provides: access, prestige, a controlled ascent. And that money feeds the machine. It funds more missions, more influence, more reach. The Jesuit network doesn't advertise itself. It doesn't need to. It's embedded, rooted, trusted. It does not command power. It becomes it. By the time the world realizes where an idea came from, the Jesuits are already 3 moves ahead. And the face you see on the screen, the signature at the bottom of the bill, the voice behind the podium, they may never mention the society, but the society has already shaped how they see the world. So when we talk about global influence, or we talk about politics, about money, about media, but rarely do we talk about the Jesuits. And that is their greatest success. Because true power doesn't need recognition, it only needs access. And the Jesuits have had it for over 400 years. The White House, a symbol of democracy, a seat of modern power, a beacon of freedom. At least that's the story. But inside its marble bones, beneath the speeches, behind the briefings, there are fingerprints that trace back centuries. Not just to revolution, but to Rome, to classrooms filled with Latin and logic, to lectures on theology disguised as philosophy, to the slow, deliberate formation of minds meant to lead, Jesuit minds. Because long before they sat in the Oval Office, some of America's most powerful presidents sat in Jesuit classrooms. Bill Clinton, trained in part by Georgetown, John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic president, educated by Jesuits at Boston College. Even Joe Biden speaks of his Jesuit advisors with a kind of reverence, and those are only the visible names, because behind every administration are cabinets, advisors, speechwriters, legal minds, strategists, and many of them walked the halls of Fordham, Loyola, Georgetown, Santa Clara, Jesuit institutions that teach not just knowledge, but formation. The ex-priest said, "They don't just train leaders, they train the people who train the leaders." It's a recursive loop, a pattern, power educating power, not just for influence, but for alignment, because Jesuit education doesn't scream ideology, it whispers worldview. It teaches that morality is rooted in structure, that obedience can wear the mask of logic, that diplomacy is just theology with a new vocabulary. And the result, presidents who think they're independent, but who carry the echoes of a formation they never quite left. It's not a conspiracy, it's a system. And systems work because they don't need to be seen to be effective. Georgetown's School of Foreign Service has produced CIA directors, secretaries of state, ambassadors. Fordham's alumni walk the halls of Wall Street and Capitol Hill. Boston College grads sit on Supreme Court benches, and behind them, always behind them, is the influence of the society. Not direct control, not orders whispered in dark chapels, but something more potent, a shaping of conscience, a refinement of thought, an imprint of obedience to a higher architecture, one that doesn't end at national borders. Because the Jesuits don't serve nations, they serve an order, a mission. And the Black Pope, he doesn't need to make demands, he only needs to form the minds that will one day write the laws. So when a president speaks of justice, when a senator quotes scripture, when a judge invokes natural law, listen closely. You might be hearing more than politics, you might be hearing formation, you might be hearing Rome. Because power that educates is more dangerous than power that commands. It doesn't need to argue, it doesn't need to rule, it only needs to plant the seed and let the world believe it grew there all on its own. The faithful gather in the square, eyes turned upward, cameras pointed at the balcony, the white robes appear, the smile, the wave, a blessing spoken in Latin, soft, rehearsed, reassuring. The world sees the Pope, the shepherd of souls, the moral compass of over 1 billion people. But what if that face, it is just that? A face? A symbol? A carefully chosen image? A spiritual monarch built for pageantry and presence? What if the real hands guiding the church are folded quietly in the dark corridors behind him? Not the cardinals, not the bishops, but the superior general, the Black Pope. It sounds like fiction, like something from an old novel or a whisper in a dimly lit chapel. But the theory persists, not because of scandal, but because of structure. The White Pope changes, they come and go, each one bringing his own tone, his own gestures, his own message. But the Black Pope? His legacy lasts decades, sometimes longer. His command is not confined to one office. He doesn't govern from a pulpit. He governs from within. Jesuit influence doesn't make headlines. It shapes them, and many believe it shapes popes too. The ex-priest once said, "Every white pope sits on Peter's throne, but not every white pope chooses how far he can lean." The deeper layers of the church, its schools, its diplomacy, its archives, its finances, are often touched first by Jesuit hands. By the time a papal directive reaches the world, it has passed through filters, through advisors, through thought shapers trained not in doctrine but in systems. And those systems, Jesuit. The White Pope may hold the keys, but who built the locks? The papal puppet theory doesn't accuse, it observes. It sees the harmony between what the Pope says and what the order promotes. It sees how shifts in church policy often echo long-standing Jesuit positions nurtured quietly, far from the headlines, until the world is ready to hear them. The theory doesn't claim the White Pope is powerless, only that he operates within boundaries already drawn, not overtly, not cruelly, but masterfully, through formation, through relationship, through expectation. And if he strays too far, if he questions too much, he is surrounded, not by enemies, but by loyal minds shaped to think in one direction, trained not to rebel, but to gently correct, not through confrontation, through consensus. That is the brilliance of the structure. It does not demand obedience. It produces it, refined, internalized, unquestioned. So when you look at the Pope, the man in white, the voice of comfort, the image of holiness, ask yourself, who placed him there? Who shaped his voice? And whose vision does he quietly serve as he speaks to the world? Because power in the church has never been simple, never singular, and sometimes the throne is real. But the strings are pulled from somewhere else entirely, somewhere deeper, somewhere older, somewhere dressed in black. They were never just priests. They walked with rosaries, yes, but also with maps, with ciphers, with a fluency in the languages of both faith and strategy. The Jesuits were not built for cloisters. They were born for motion, for crossing borders, for stepping into the chaos and leaving with control. From the moment the Society of Jesus was formed, their missions were never just religious. They were political, diplomatic, covert. They entered nations before diplomats. They made contact before armies. They studied cultures not to convert, but to understand, to influence, to shape from within, and sometimes to destabilize. You won't find this written in Vatican press releases. You won't hear it spoken from pulpits. But look closely, and the pattern is there. In China, Jesuit missionaries gained the trust of emperors, not just by preaching, but by serving as astronomers, scientists, engineers. In Japan, they maneuvered through courts and clans, gathering information, building alliances, positioning themselves as advisors, until the political winds turned and they vanished. In South America, they created entire territories, Jesuit reductions, miniature theocracies where the order governed with its own laws, its own armies, its own vision of society. They said it was for the people, for protection, for salvation. But critics, even popes, saw something else, a parallel empire, one not under Rome's full control, one too powerful, too independent. And then came the suppressions. The order was banned, disbanded, scattered, but not destroyed, because even without robes they still had networks, influence, alliances in royal courts and merchant houses. And when revolution stirred, in France, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, there were always whispers that Jesuit hands had been there first, advising, translating, guiding, not in the name of chaos, but in the name of reformation, of control reshaped, not broken. The ex-priest once said, A Jesuit doesn't need to start the fire, he just needs to know where the wind will blow. Even in modern times, the order's fingerprints show up in unexpected places. Priests stationed in war zones before the first bomb drops. Schools established in territories on the brink of collapse. And always, their movements protected by a higher cause, faith, charity, education. But behind that veil, intelligence moves. Information is gathered, relationships are built, future leaders are marked and remembered. It's not espionage in the traditional sense, it's something older, more refined. A form of influence that looks like mission work but works like diplomacy. The Black Pope doesn't issue commands on battlefields, but his generals are everywhere. And their loyalty is not to nations, not to flags, only to the order. So ask yourself, when an uprising begins, when a regime falls, when a new power rises, who was there before it happened? Who knew the terrain, the language, the hearts of the people? Who trained the leaders? Who shaped the narrative? The Jesuits have always gone where others fear to tread, and not just for souls, but for structures, for systems, for subtle, enduring control. Not forbidden in name, but in nature, because the most powerful missions are the ones that history never admits happened, and the most effective missionaries are the ones you forget were ever there. They arrived before the flags, before the gunboats, before the treaties were signed and the maps redrawn. The Jesuits were there, boots in the mud, scrolls in their packs, eyes open. They came as missionaries, that was the story. To bring light to the heathens, to baptize the unknowing, to plant crosses in lands never touched by Rome. But what if the mission wasn't just spiritual? What if they weren't just saving souls, but gathering intelligence? The Americas, a vast chaotic mosaic of civilizations, empires built without Europe's permission, cultures layered over centuries holding secrets no Western crown could decipher, and into that unknown stepped the Jesuits. They moved differently than the conquistadors. They learned the languages, listened, watched. They didn't demand tribute. They asked questions. They mapped rivers, counted tribes, noted customs, not in journals of wonder, but in files, reports, data, sent back to Rome, to Madrid, to Lisbon, information wrapped in missionary language, updates on the harvest, the conversions, the resistance. But beneath it all, a cataloguing of a world in transition, one collapsing, one being reshaped. They studied the people, not just to convert, but to understand how power worked here. Who ruled? Who submitted? What myths held the people together? What fears could be exploited? The Jesuits didn't just bring scripture, they brought strategy. They built missions, yes, but they also built maps, built records, built profiles. And behind every chapel they raised, there was a deeper structure forming, one that helped prepare the terrain for the empires that would follow. Spain, Portugal, France. Their flags followed the cross. But the cross was already gathering intelligence. The ex-priest used to call it spiritual reconnaissance. He said the Jesuits knew that if you understand a people's myths, you control their future. If you know how they see the stars, you can guide how they tell time. If you know the gods they fear, you can offer your own as savior. And once the old stories collapse, the new story moves in. Polished, translated, immutable. But it wasn't just about culture, it was about territory, resources, influence. The Jesuits reported on gold veins long before the ships arrived, on fertile valleys, on strategic mountains. And when conflict rose, they were already trusted by tribes, by chiefs, by governors. They brokered peace when peace served them, and they stepped back when conquest needed room to breathe. Some say they resisted violence, others say they simply stepped aside and recorded the results, but always, they remained, documenting, adapting, surviving. The missions they left behind became settlements, then towns, then cities, and the names, Santa Fe, San Ignacio, São Paulo, still echo the order's presence, not as conquerors, as cartographers of the spirit, of the land, of the future. Was it faith? Perhaps, but also something colder, strategic, enduring, invisible. The Jesuits didn't take land, they took memory, And in doing so, they shaped a continent not with swords, but with silence. And silence, once embedded, can last longer than any empire ever could. They had risen too far, too fast. A whisper became a presence became an institution became a threat. By the 18th century, the Jesuits were everywhere, confessors to kings, teachers to the elite, missionaries in every corner of the globe, and with each step forward they collected more knowledge, more trust, more influence. But influence has a cost. The thrones they once served began to see shadows, not servants, but rivals, and the church itself, its hierarchy, its older orders, its entrenched power, began to feel crowded. The Jesuits had become too independent, too global, too disciplined. They answered to their general, not always to Rome, not always to tradition. Their loyalty was inward, their network, a state within a state. And then came the suppression. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV issued a decree. The Society of Jesus was disbanded, dissolved, erased, at least on paper. The reasons were political, pressure from monarchs, from courts in France, Spain, Portugal. The order was accused of meddling in affairs that did not belong to the church, of amassing too much wealth, too much information, too much influence over minds and monarchies. And so they were undone, not by heresy, but by success. Their schools were shut down, their missions dissolved, their priests scattered. Some went underground, some were absorbed into other orders, others waited, because they knew something the world had forgotten. The Jesuits were not built to disappear, they were built to endure, and 40 years later, they returned. In 1814, Pope Pius VII restored the order, not in secret, not with shame, but openly, as if the Church had realized something essential, that in a world changing too fast, too violently, it needed men who could adapt, who can navigate diplomacy and dogma, faith and empire, classroom and confession. Men trained not just to preach, but to think, to lead, to reshape the edges of a crumbling church. The Jesuits came back not as rebels, but as necessity, and they picked up right where they left off, rebuilding schools, restarting missions, reclaiming the networks that had never fully disappeared. Some say the suppression was a warning, others say it was a test, but the Jesuits took it as neither. They took it as confirmation that their work mattered, that their presence was felt, that their silence had power. The ex-priest once said, "You know who controls the room not by who speaks, but by who cannot be ignored." And for nearly 5 decades the world tried to ignore the Jesuits. It failed, because you cannot erase what has already embedded itself into the structure of civilization, not with decrees, not with pressure, and not with fear. The Jesuits do not retreat, they adapt, they survive, they return. Not louder, not prouder, just deeper. So remember this. The most dangerous power is not the one that shouts. It's the one you think you've silenced until you look again and realize it never left. There is a Vatican most never see, beyond the marble columns, beyond the gilded domes and crowded courtyards, beyond the tourists, the cameras, the echo of footsteps on polished stone. There's another Vatican, one of sealed doors, dim corridors, and shelves that reach so high they disappear into shadow. This is not the Vatican of pilgrims. It is the Vatican of archivists, of gatekeepers, of watchers. And behind so many of those locked rooms stand the Jesuits, not as guards, as curators, as architects of access. They do not boast, they do not broadcast, but the records, the manuscripts, the centuries-old secrets. Many pass through Jesuit hands before they ever meet the eyes of historians, or even popes. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, once called the Secret Archive, holds over 50 miles of shelving, letters from kings, maps of forgotten empires, heretical texts too dangerous to destroy, and too powerful to release. It is a kingdom of memory, and memory, when controlled, is the most potent form of power. The Jesuits understand this. They always have. Their role is not to rewrite, it is to withhold, to decide when and what the world is ready to remember. They are trained for it, formed in the art of discernment, not just of spirit but of narrative, what pieces belong, which truths serve the structure, which ones must sleep. Some say the Jesuits have their own private libraries within the Vatican walls, rooms where the public is never invited, where banned gospels are studied in silence, where ancient scripts are analysed not for faith but for strategy. There are whispers of entire wings with no record of their contents, not even among the archivists, accessible only by those with the right formation, the right vows. And the Superior General, the Black Pope, holds keys that even the White Pope may not. The ex-priest spoke of vaults beneath vaults, of books written in languages the modern world has forgotten, of artifacts that could realign the way we understand our past, our faith, our purpose. But they remain buried, because access is not about curiosity, it's about control. And who better to control it than an order trained to obey without question, to guard what they themselves might never fully understand? Knowledge, in Jesuit hands, is not a gift. It is a weapon, one they choose to use only when the timing serves the mission, and until then, they wait, they preserve, they listen as the world debates shadows while the source of light remains hidden behind layers of marble and silence and discipline. So when you imagine the Vatican Library, don't imagine a scholar with a lantern. Imagine a network, a structure, a system designed to remember everything and to reveal almost nothing. Because history is not lost, it's organized, categorized, filed away in a vault the world doesn't know exists. And the Jesuits? They hold the index. The throne is not as private as it seems. Behind every crown, behind every decree, there is always a voice whispering softly, a voice that does not rule but listens with precision, with patience, and with the full authority of God's forgiveness. That voice, more often than history admits, belonged to a Jesuit, not as a court official, not as a public figure, but as a confessor, a priest in the shadows of palaces, a man in black with a seat just close enough to power's ear but never in its light. Because confession is not just a ritual, it is a map, a doorway into the soul of rulers, kings who would never trust ministers, who would never weep before their own blood. They knelt before Jesuits, poured out sins, fears, desires, secrets. And the Jesuits? They listened, not to condemn, not even to absolve, but to understand. And understanding, when repeated over years, becomes influence. The confessor becomes a mirror, reflecting what the king cannot see, or what he fears to name. And if the mirror speaks, if the voice gently suggests a path, a correction, a course of action, it often becomes law, but not by force, by trust, because confession is intimate, sacred, legally protected. The seal of confession means a priest cannot reveal what is said, but the priest still knows it, still holds it. And when that priest serves the society of Jesus, when he is trained not just in theology, but in psychology, history, and power, the information doesn't end in forgiveness. It moves, it builds, it becomes a tool for shaping the future from behind the veil of conscience. The ex-priest once called confession the most perfect intelligence tool ever designed, because unlike spies, it needs no coercion, no bribes, only guilt. Guilt, when combined with the hope of salvation, makes even the proudest ruler lay everything bare, and the Jesuits have long understood how rare that kind of access is. They do not ask questions, they wait, they guide. They offer the comfort of absolution while collecting the truth of an empire. They hear not just individual sins, but systemic flaws, rebellions before they form, doubts before they spread, cracks in the foundation of kingdoms, and then they act. Not through blackmail, that's crude, through suggestion, through redirection, through shaping a ruler's conscience toward decisions that benefit not just the crown, but the greater mission. Because the society doesn't serve kings, it serves something older, more disciplined, more enduring. So while courts debated policy, while councils argued theology, the Jesuit confessor sat quietly, absorbing the raw material of power. and crafting from it a narrative the king could follow, believing it was his own. That is the genius of their role. They don't command, they influence. And in that soft, sacred space, in the stillness of whispered regret, they extract more than spies ever could. Because to rule a kingdom requires strength. But to shape the man who wears the crown? All it takes is silence and the right question at just the right moment. And no one asks better questions than the Jesuits. The end has always been written. In scripture, in smoke, in dreams too strange to forget. For 2,000 years, prophets and poets have warned that the final chapter would begin in silence, not with thunder, but with ritual, with the changing of robes, with a man ascending to a throne he was never meant to hold. And in those whispers, a name returns, the Black Pope. Not a villain, not a saviour, but something stranger, a signal. For centuries, Catholic mystics spoke of a final pontiff, a shepherd who would lead the flock through tribulation, not away from it. Some call him Petrus Romanus, the last on the secret list of popes, allegedly revealed to Saint Malachi. Others don't use a name, just a shadow, a figure in black, guiding from behind, speaking without speaking. And in this shadow, the Jesuit superior general has taken on a weight he never claimed, a title he never announced. But the world noticed. Because for the first time in history, a Jesuit became pope, not just a teacher, not just an advisor. He sat on Peter's throne, and the world shifted. The line that once separated the order and the chair blurred, and for those watching closely, a prophecy stirred. Not because of any crime, not because of any speech, but because a pattern had been broken or fulfilled. The Black Pope had always been behind the scenes, but now he was also in the light, and some said this was the sign. The last pope would not wear white in spirit, even if his robes gleamed on camera. He would come from the order built on obedience, on silence, on strategic control. He would not be chosen by accident, and with him the clock would start to tick louder. The ex-priest once whispered, "They believe history moves in cycles, but the last cycle is always the quietest." And it is quiet, too quiet. The Jesuits now shape doctrine, education, diplomacy. They no longer advise, they direct. And yet, so few speak of it. So few ask what it means when prophecy and power intertwine. Was the list of Saint Malachi real? Was the final line ever meant to be read? Or was it meant to be lived in moments like this? With a church reshaped, with a papacy that no longer looks like it once did, with a throne that now whispers with two voices, one white, one black. And beneath it all the murmurs grow, that this was always the plan, not an ending of destruction, but of unveiling, of hidden things returning, of secrets long buried becoming unavoidable. The Black Pope is not the Antichrist, but he may be the gatekeeper, the final architect before something breaks or begins. Because in every great story there comes a moment when the mask slips, when the symbols align, when the final player steps into view, not with a trumpet, but with a gesture that no one recognizes until it's too late. And maybe that gesture has already happened, and maybe we're already living in the prophecy no one was brave enough to name. He speaks no louder than a whisper. He nods when asked, bows when summoned, serves when needed. But underneath the robe, beneath the humility, there is something unshakable, not pride, not ambition, obedience, but not to the Pope, not entirely. Jesuit obedience is something older, more precise, sharper than loyalty to any man. It is not political, it is not sentimental, it is structural, engineered into the bones of the Society of Jesus, and at the core of that structure lies the seal of silence. This seal is not a vow of muteness. It's not about keeping secrets, it's about becoming one. When a man joins the Jesuits, he does not merely submit his actions, he surrenders his thoughts, his judgment, his will. Not in a moment of emotional faith, but in layers, tested, trained, refined, until he no longer hesitates when commanded, until he no longer asks why. The ex-priest once said, "It's not that we couldn't speak, it's that we forgot what it felt like to question." Because the Jesuits don't just obey, they obey in perfect alignment, like cogs in a machine built for silence. And the Pope? He may be the head of the church, but within the society, he is not the general. The superior general, the Black Pope, holds dominion over his order. Even when the Pope commands, Jesuit obedience is filtered through the general's discernment. If a directive conflicts with the mission, with the integrity of the order, it is weighed, not automatically followed. Because Jesuit obedience is not blind. It is calculated, hierarchical, strategic. Their structure allows for questions, but only inside the circle, never in public, never in contradiction. And once a decision is made, it is final. The Jesuit becomes a vessel, a function, a will carried out without resistance. Some say that's devotion, others call it programming. But either way, it works. It allows the society to operate as one body with many minds, moving in sync, adapting without conflict, executing missions without hesitation, even when those missions are morally grey, politically charged, spiritually complex. The seal of silence is not about hiding actions. It's about eliminating fracture, eliminating dissent, eliminating the very possibility of disobedience. It creates a unity stronger than democracy, more enduring than doctrine, and it allows the Jesuits to do what no other order can, to operate globally, across cultures, within governments, beneath institutions, without ever revealing who truly commands them. The Pope may sit on the throne, but even he must consider what the Jesuits will do with his words, because they will not disobey. But they may interpret, they may delay, redirect, translate into silence what was meant to be action, and who will challenge them? They answer only to themselves, and to the structure they have served since 1540, a structure that does not bend for politics, not even papal politics. So when you hear the word obedience, don't imagine a chain of command, imagine a cathedral built out of silence, a silence that moves, thinks, decides, and when it chooses to speak, it does so with the force of something deeper than law. It speaks with the weight of centuries, and the confidence of those who know they will never be questioned. Money has no soul, but it moves like it does. It flows quietly in currents beneath palaces, beneath ministries, beneath churches, and where it flows, power follows. The Vatican has long been called a spiritual empire, but empires are not built on prayers alone. They are built on gold, on ledgers, on accounts so old even their origin stories are sealed. And in the deepest vaults of that sacred economy, you'll find whispers of the Jesuits, not as thieves, not as bankers, as architects. Because while others counted coins, the Society of Jesus was learning how to shape capital itself. They built universities, yes, but they also built endowments. They founded missions, but not without resources that needed protection, multiplication, growth. And they learned fast, faster than the church, faster than the monarchs. They understood that money was not evil. It was leverage. It was access. It was influence written in numbers. The ex-priest once said the society never feared wealth, only waste. So they invested in land, in education, in quiet businesses that served the greater structure, not for profit, for preservation, because ideas without support fade, but ideas with funding become institutions, and soon the Jesuits had institutions everywhere. On paper they were separate, independent, unconnected, but beneath, one vision, one mission, one network. Some say the Jesuits advised on the founding of major banks. Others believe they shaped fiscal policies in countries they never ruled, not through direct control, but through influence, through education, through men they had formed, men who rose to oversee treasuries, corporations, markets, and when those men made decisions, they carried within them a philosophy crafted by the order, discipline, hierarchy, long-term thinking. The Vatican Bank itself, a source of countless scandals, mysteries, deaths, has long been rumoured to have Jesuit fingerprints on its ledgers. Not as administrators, as advisors, as quiet overseers, not managing accounts, but managing the men who did. Because power doesn't always write the check. Sometimes it decides who signs it. And when that influence stretches across centuries, across continents, you no longer need ownership. You have alignment. You have access. You have obedience shaped not by command but by formation. Jesuit schools have trained financiers, economists, CEOs, presidents of central banks, not to enrich the order, but to keep the world moving toward an order they understand. One that values control through structure, discipline over chaos, stability over transparency. Because transparency is a modern virtue, but secrecy is an ancient strength, and money, when guided by silence, can become a cathedral of unseen decisions. So next time you hear of a global shift, a financial collapse, a market correction, ask not just where the money went, ask who saw it coming, and who did not lose when everyone else did, because the Jesuits have survived empires, and they've done it not by avoiding power, but by understanding its currency. And in a world where faith may fade, but systems remain, they've chosen their investments wisely. They called them schools, centers of learning, places of discipline, reason, faith. But behind the textbooks and uniforms, they were something else, something older, more precise. They were foundations, engines, quiet recruitment grounds for a vision far greater than the students ever realized. The Jesuits didn't just build schools, they built systems, global ones, from Rome to Rio, Boston to Beirut, Paris to the Philippines. Wherever minds could be shaped, they planted a flag, not a national one, a spiritual one. But it wasn't just about catechism, it wasn't just about molding believers, it was about creating continuity across languages, across borders, across regimes, because belief fades, but loyalty lasts. And Jesuit education didn't demand obedience, it cultivated it, subtly, slowly, through method, through structure, through relentless excellence. The students who passed through Jesuit classrooms weren't all Catholic. Many weren't religious at all, but that didn't matter because the mission wasn't just conversion, it was formation, to think in a certain rhythm, to solve problems within a particular frame, to see the world not as chaotic but as hierarchical, ordered, guided. And in that framing, power becomes not something to resist but something to align with. The ex-priest once called it intellectual imprinting. He said the goal wasn't to control minds, but to write the software that would run inside them. And it worked. Look at the alumni, judges, presidents, diplomats, billionaires, men and women who may not wear the collar, but who speak with the cadence of those who were formed to follow a deeper order. They carry the values, the habits, the silence, the deference to hierarchy even when they call it meritocracy. They believe they are independent, free-thinking, modern, but underneath, a code, invisible, familiar only to those who know the formation process, who know that loyalty isn't sworn in ceremonies, it's woven into the way you interpret everything. Jesuit schools are elite for a reason. They cost more, they promise more, and they deliver not just in test scores but in connections. A global fraternity that doesn't need a name, that recognizes its own through subtle cues, shared references, a look, a word, a silence. And once inside, doors open, doors others never even see. Because Jesuit education doesn't just elevate, it selects. It identifies who can be trusted to carry forward the mission. And once identified, those individuals are never truly out of reach. They're networked, remembered, tapped, when the moment is right. So what looks like education is often recruitment, not for priesthood, but for something harder to name, for a worldview, for an unspoken allegiance, to the mission, to the structure, to the legacy of a quiet empire, built not on territory, but on thought. And once a mind is shaped like that, it rarely changes. It simply advances. So ask yourself, where do the world's most powerful minds get formed? And whose fingerprints are still on the chalk that wrote the first lessons? Because if you follow those lines far enough, they don't lead to classrooms, they lead to corridors the public never walks, and to decisions made in silence by those trained to never speak of who trained them. They walk past them every day, tourists, students, worshippers. They admire the marble, the domes, the stained glass glowing like frozen fire, but they don't see, not really, because Jesuit architecture, true Jesuit architecture, was never meant to merely inspire. It was meant to instruct, to imprint, to conceal, and above all, to speak, but only to those trained to listen. Every column, every curve, every etching on the stone holds a layer beneath the beauty, a second message, a language of the initiated. In Rome, the church of the Jesuits' mother church, looks like any other Baroque masterpiece. But trace the gold, follow the frescoes, look closely at the ceiling, and you'll find it, IHS, the Jesuit seal. But it's not just the name of Jesus, it's a cipher, a key, surrounded by rays of light, pierced by 3 nails, often framed by the sun. Some say it stands for Jesus hominum salvator, Jesus, Saviour of men, but others whisper that the symbol hides a different meaning, a solar code, a reference to ancient worship, to continuity disguised as change. Because the Jesuits knew how to speak to the subconscious, they borrowed from what came before, adapted it, baptized it, and left it etched into the stone so that even centuries later it would still hum beneath the surface. The sunburst, the all-seeing eye, the twin pillars, the 5-pointed star. Each appears again and again in Jesuit chapels, universities, altarpieces, not randomly, but precisely, not decorative, declarative, a visual theology, a map. And then there are the numbers, 3, 7, 12, repeated in arches, steps, windows. Not because they're pleasing, because they're encoded. Numerology borrowed from older systems, reframed, made Christian in name but something else in rhythm. The ex-priest once said, "You can rewrite words, but symbols never forget." And the Jesuits never stopped writing with them. Their architecture teaches. It orients. A student walking through a Jesuit college is being trained even before the first lecture. The layout of buildings, the sacred geometry of courtyards, the progression from shadow to light as one moves toward the chapel. It's not accidental, it's ritual, carved in brick, poured in stone. Even the silence inside their churches feels engineered. Because it is, they want you to feel something you can't explain, something ancient, something disciplined. The Jesuits don't rely on persuasion alone. They shape the environment so that you arrive already softened, already listening for something you didn't know you were looking for. That's the genius of the design, not to reveal, to condition. And for those who know what to look for, the message is never stopped. They're still there, on facades, in floor mosaics, in the way the light enters at exactly the right hour on exactly the right day, marking moments that only the initiated can read. So next time you pass a Jesuit church, don't look at the altar. Look up, look down, look between. Because what you're meant to see is only half the story, and the other half, the real half, was hidden in plain sight. They called themselves the Society of Jesus, but even that name feels like a veil. It evokes simplicity, service, devotion, but beneath it lurks a complexity that has drawn suspicion for centuries. Not because of scandal, but because of silence, because of the way they operate, the way they recruit, the way they speak in riddles, but move with precision. There are those who believe the Jesuits are more than religious, much more, that their rituals go deeper than Mass, that their symbols reach further back than Christ, and that their true power doesn't come from the church, but from something far older, far stranger, esoteric. The word echoes like a warning. Secret knowledge, hidden paths, an inner circle within the inner circle. Some point to their formation process. Years of spiritual exercises, guided meditations, dream journals, and silent retreats designed not just to build faith, but to break the ego, to erase the self, and then rebuild it, not as a man, but as an instrument, an extension of something larger, something unseen. They don't study just scripture, they study systems, philosophy, psychology, languages, myth. And in the echoes of those disciplines, some say they uncover truths that were never meant to be spoken aloud. The ex-priest once whispered, "It's not about what they teach, it's about what they suggest between the lines." Because the Jesuits know how to speak in layers, a parable here, a symbol there, a ritual gesture that means one thing to the novice, and something entirely different to the one who has walked further into the dark. And then there's the structure. No other religious order resembles a military unit. No other order has a superior general, a command hierarchy, a discipline that doesn't just obey, but vanishes when needed. This isn't monasticism, this is strategy. And strategy, when wrapped in devotion, becomes something almost untraceable. Esoteric orders across history have followed the same template. Outer teachings for the many, inner teachings for the few, rituals that conceal, symbols that initiate, power granted not through inheritance, but through insight. And the Jesuits fit that mold a little too well. Their global network, their silence, their access to archives that no historian will ever touch, all of it feels like the architecture of something deeper. Not a religion, a design. One aimed not at salvation, but at something else entirely. Control, awakening, preservation of truths the rest of the church can't admit it holds. The answers don't come easily, because those who reach the edge either fall silent or disappear, and those who speak, like the ex-priest, only speak in fragments, in metaphors, as if naming the truth would give it too much power, or worse, call it forward. So maybe the Society of Jesus is just that, a society of men devoted to Christ, to the church, to the mission, or maybe, just maybe, they are something else, something older, something layered beneath the visible church, reaching past doctrine, past scripture, into the roots of mystery itself. Not just stewards of faith, but keepers of a hidden architecture, one built in silence, preserved in code, and passed down one whisper at a time. They gaze at the stars, but not from telescopes in Silicon Valley and not under the flag of any nation. They watch from Vatican territory, under holy silence, in observatories built by priests, funded by an order that swore itself to earth, yet never stopped reaching for the heavens, the Jesuit astronomers. A phrase that seems like contradiction, but it is real, it is old, and it is deliberate. The Church once condemned Galileo for challenging scripture with science, for saying the earth moved, that the heavens were not fixed. But now, the Church watches the stars, not in spite of Galileo, but perhaps because of him. And it is the Jesuits who hold the keys. Their observatory on Mount Graham in Arizona, remote, quiet, protected. It bears a name that whispers controversy, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope. But it's not just the technology that draws curiosity, it's the reason. Why does a religious order sworn to serve a divine saviour need to study distant galaxies, chart exoplanets, track celestial anomalies most people will never even hear about? They say it's to explore God's creation, to reconcile faith with science, to remind humanity that the stars are part of the divine story. But others aren't so sure, because the Jesuits don't watch the same way others do. They aren't just cataloguing, they are discerning it. They look for patterns, timelines, events. They cross-reference scripture with star maps, prophecy with planetary motion. Some believe they are searching for signs, not of extraterrestrial life, but of return, of alignment, of cycles foretold by ancient calendars and hidden texts long buried in the secret archives. The ex-priest spoke of celestial thresholds, moments when what's above unlocks what lies below. He said the Jesuits believe in timing, in cosmological gates, in events that can't be seen unless you know exactly where to look, and when. And the stars, they are clocks, silent witnesses, markers in the great unfolding, which means the telescopes are not just for science, they're for watching prophecy unfold, for confirming what the order already suspects, that something is coming, and it will not announce itself with trumpets, but with quiet precision in the night sky. There are also rumours that Jesuits watch for anomalies, objects that move or against the laws of physics, lights that flicker outside explanation, and when asked, they smile, they say nothing. Because silence is their most sacred language. They publish scientific papers, they attend conferences, they talk of galaxies and cosmic dust. But within the order they talk of signs, of alignments, of return. Some even whisper they are preparing the church for the day the heavens speak back. Not in metaphor, not in scripture, but literally, what are they looking for? Maybe not aliens, maybe not comets. Maybe they're looking for confirmation that the stories told in stained glass were never just stories, that the watchers have always been watched, and that one day the sky will open, not in wrath, but in revelation. And when it does, the Jesuits will not be surprised, because they've been watching all along, not to prove, not to disprove, but to prepare for what comes when the stars finally speak. Two secretive orders, two networks of influence, two philosophies cloaked in light, but moving in opposite directions, the Jesuits and the Freemasons. One, forged in the crucible of Rome, sworn to serve Christ's church through absolute obedience and silence. The other, born from Enlightenment ideals dedicated to reason, liberty, and brotherhood outside the reach of religion. And between them, a war. Or so the story goes. It's a feud whispered in archives, printed in forbidden books, and repeated in conspiracy circles with the same breathless awe usually reserved for ghost stories. Some say it began in the 1700s when Freemasonry spread through Europe like wildfire, gathering aristocrats, artists, and scientists into lodges that operated just beyond the church's control. The Jesuits saw this as a threat, a rival ideology, a system of belief that wore no collar and bowed to no altar. And so, the tension grew. Freemasons called for freedom of thought. Jesuits called it rebellion. Freemasons lifted man through reason. Jesuits warned of reason without morality. The Enlightenment offered light, but the Jesuits had always known that too much light can also blind. And from this divergence came the whispers of a war. Not a war of bullets, a war of symbols, of influence, of control, each embedded in governments, in academia, in banks and palaces, each claiming truth and accusing the other of distortion. The ex-priest once said, "If you want to understand the world, follow the silence, but if you want to misunderstand it, follow the light." And maybe that's the real story, not a feud, but a performance. Because some suggest that the Jesuits and Freemasons aren't enemies at all. They're complements. Two halves of the same coin. One operates through faith, the other through reason. One kneels in robes, the other stands in aprons. But both influence the same corridors, educate the same elites, shape the same future from different angles. It's a theory that shifts everything, that the war between them is deliberate, a spectacle, designed to capture attention while something deeper moves unseen. Because what better way to protect a hidden structure than to divide its face into opposing masks? Let one side condemn the other. Let them argue, write books, cast blame. And in that distraction, maintain the real work undisturbed. Still, the signs of conflict are real. Popes have condemned Freemasonry. Masonic texts accuse the Jesuits of manipulation and control. Churches excommunicate, lodges retaliate, and yet both continue, both thrive, both survive revolutions, wars, collapse. They adapt, they re-emerge, they claim irreconcilable truths, and still draw power from the same river. So are they enemies? Maybe. Or maybe they are the perfect dialectic, the thesis and antithesis whose endless opposition generates the energy to keep the structure intact. Because whether you follow the path of faith or the path of reason, someone designed both roads. And the real architects, they don't care which one you walk, as long as you never stop to ask who drew the map. So if the Jesuits and Freemasons are at war, perhaps it's a war meant to be watched, not won. And in that quiet mutual recognition they continue, side by side, or face to face, depending on which light you choose to follow. They are masters of ceremony. You see them on holy days, in robes, in procession, moving with practiced stillness through incense and Latin. Their rituals are clean, disciplined, recognizable. But what about the ones you never see? The ones that happen in silence, behind closed doors, under stone ceilings no layperson has ever entered, because every order has its public face. But the Jesuits, they were built for more than appearances. They were forged in secrecy, formed through exercises that strip the self and rebuild it from the inside. And that kind of formation requires ritual, not the kind printed in missals, but the kind passed from voice to ear. One generation to the next, unwritten, undeniable. The ex-priest used to say, "You don't learn who you are until they take you apart in silence." He spoke of rooms lit only by candles, of men kneeling in complete darkness, of vows spoken not in front of altars, but in front of symbols whose meaning wasn't explained until years later. He hinted at initiations that weren't ceremonies, but experiences, intellectual tests that felt like riddles, moral scenarios designed to fracture comfort. They call it discernment, but within it, a process, a ritual architecture that reshapes the soul to align perfectly with the will of the order. Some who've studied the Jesuits say the spiritual exercises of Ignatius are more than meditations. They're encoded, layered, each exercise an awakening, each phase a descent, and each silence a gate. There are rumors of deeper rites, the third probation, a year of complete erasure, where the candidate loses all identity, no name, no past, only obedience, only stillness. And those who emerge are not just priests, they are instruments, minds sharpened like surgical blades. This isn't superstition, this is design. The Jesuits understand that true loyalty isn't inherited, it's carved. And carving the soul requires ritual, private, unrecorded, but repeated across centuries. Symbols appear in their chapels that are never explained in sermons. Eyes encircled by flame, hands pierced without blood, stars bound by thorns. Each one a signal, not to the faithful, but to the formed. So what happens when a Jesuit rises to the highest ranks? When he's no longer a student but a guide? Does the ritual deepen? Is there another veil behind the veil? The ex-priest never answered directly. He only smiled and said, "There are things we remember only because we're told we promised never to forget." And that was enough, because some rites don't need candles. They require only silence, only agreement, only the understanding that from this moment forward, you are no longer your own. You belong to the structure, to the mission, to the code that no outsider will ever fully name. So yes, there are rituals, and no, they are not public. They were never meant to be, because transformation isn't meant for spectacle. It's meant for those willing to disappear and be rebuilt as something more enduring than belief, as something dangerously unshakable. They are masters of ceremony. You see them on holy days, in robes, in procession, moving with practiced stillness through incense and Latin. Their rituals are clean, disciplined, recognizable. But what about the ones you never see? The ones that happen in silence, behind closed doors, under stone ceilings no layperson has ever entered, because every order has its public face. But the Jesuits, they were built for more than appearances. They were forged in secrecy, formed through exercises that strip the self and rebuild it from the inside. And that kind of formation requires ritual, not the kind printed in missals, but the kind passed from voice to ear, one generation to the next, unwritten, undeniable. The ex-priest used to say, "You don't learn who you are until they take you apart in silence." He spoke of rooms lit only by candles, of men kneeling in complete darkness, of vows spoken not in front of altars, but in front of symbols whose meaning wasn't explained until years later. He hinted at initiations that weren't ceremonies, but experiences, intellectual tests that felt like riddles, moral scenarios designed to fracture comfort. They call it discernment, but within it, a process, a ritual architecture that reshapes the soul to align perfectly with the will of the order. Some who've studied the Jesuits say the spiritual exercises of Ignatius are more than meditations. They're encoded, layered, each exercise an awakening, each phase a descent, and each silence a gate. There are rumors of deeper rites, the third probation. A year of complete erasure, where the candidate loses all identity, no name, no past, only obedience, only stillness. And those who emerge are not just priests, they are instruments, minds sharpened like surgical blades. This isn't superstition, this is design. The Jesuits understand that true loyalty isn't inherited, it's carved. And carving the soul requires ritual, private, unrecorded, but repeated across centuries. Symbols appear in their chapels that are never explained in sermons, eyes encircled by flame, hands pierced without blood, stars bound by thorns, each one a signal, not to the faithful but to the formed. So what happens when a Jesuit rises to the highest ranks, when he's no longer a student but a guide? Does the ritual deepen? Is there another veil behind the veil? The ex-priest never answered directly, he only smiled and said, "There are things we remember only because we're told we promised never to forget." And that was enough. Because some rites don't need candles, they require only silence, only agreement, only the understanding that from this moment forward, you are no longer your own. You belong to the structure, to the mission, to the code that no outsider will ever fully name. So yes, there are rituals, and no, they are not public. They were never meant to be. Because transformation isn't meant for spectacle, it's meant for those willing to disappear and be rebuilt, as something more enduring than belief, as something dangerously unshakable. He was never famous, not a cardinal, not a bishop, just a priest. Quiet, intelligent, trained by the society, and trusted. For years he moved through corridors few even knew existed. He held a keycard to the archives, taught at a prestigious Jesuit university, advised quietly on matters of history, theology, and, according to rumour, diplomacy. But then something shifted. He began to talk, softly at first, to close friends, to students who asked too many questions. He hinted at a structure deeper than doctrine. He used words like inversion, engineering of memory, and ritualized obedience. He said the order was no longer what it appeared to be, or maybe it never was. At first, it sounded like philosophy, like a man working through his conscience. But then came the documents. One appeared on a private blog, anonymously posted, then vanished within 48 hours. It showed fragments, pages stamped with the Society's seal, but bearing timelines and coded annotations that didn't belong to any known curriculum. A map of events, global ones, church transitions, geopolitical shifts, all subtly marked as if part of a design known only to a select few. The next week he disappeared, and no press release, no obituary, just gone. His room emptied overnight, his emails erased, his name silently removed from faculty directories. When a student asked about him, a superior replied, "He's been reassigned. Please don't pursue it further." But that student remembered she had heard him once, just once, say something strange. "If I'm not here tomorrow, know that I tried." Tried what? To warn, to reveal? Or was it simpler? Maybe he just tried to speak, in a world where silence is sacred. Because whistleblowers don't usually come from inside the order. The conditioning is too deep. The layers of obedience too tightly bound. For one to break that seal, even partially, means something inside cracked. Something too large to ignore. And that's the real mystery. Not that he vanished, but that he tried at all. That despite everything, the vows, the pressure, the centuries of reinforced silence, he still believed someone needed to know. We don't know what he saw, not exactly. Only fragments remain. A letter, unsigned, speaking of knowledge carried through centuries, of truths buried beneath faith, of rituals designed to mislead those who think they see. It ended with a line that haunts those who found it. History is not remembered, it is allowed, and I am no longer allowed to remember it. Was he silenced? Was he relocated? Or did he vanish because he stepped beyond the line the Jesuits never admit exists? The line between service and exposure, between discipline and defiance. Because inside the society, to speak is not just dangerous, it's unthinkable. And when someone tries, the structure reacts, not violently, elegantly, precisely. The man who tried to speak is now a ghost, not in death, in memory. He exists only in the quiet fear of those who heard him, only in the blank spaces where his name used to be, and in the unspoken understanding that what he knew wasn't forbidden because it was false. but because it was true. Stories shape memory, and memory shapes belief. Not just religious belief, but belief in what's possible, in what's true, in who we are. The Jesuits have known this for centuries. They were never just preachers. They were writers, linguists, historians, storytellers. When they entered new lands, they didn't just build churches. They translated language. They collected myths. They wrote the first histories. And by doing so, they got to choose what would be remembered, what would be taught, what would become fact. But their influence didn't stop with books. In the modern world, the printing press has become the screen, the sermon has become the script, and the pulpit has become the platform. So the Jesuits adapted. Of course they did. They trained writers, journalists, producers, academics. They didn't need to own the media. They just needed to shape those who would later control it. And they did. Graduates of Jesuit schools sit at the top of major news outlets, publishing houses, film studios, think tanks. Not as agents of propaganda, that's too crude, too obvious. As curators, men and women taught to think within a framework, taught to value subtlety, narrative, layers. They learned the power of telling half the truth with elegance, of omitting not to deceive but to guide. And when you shape the storyteller, you don't need to write the tale. You only need to suggest where the light should fall and what must remain in shadow. The ex-priest once said, "There's no need to censor when you already control what people want to say." And in film, it's even more refined. Jesuit-trained consultants work on historical dramas, on religious thrillers, on stories about secrets, conspiracies, and redemption. They help ensure the accuracy. They advise on tone. They suggest which ideas are too much and which ones are just enough. In publishing, their reach is subtle. Editorial boards filled with graduates who know what questions not to ask, which manuscripts to pass on, which ones to recommend. It's not a conspiracy, it's a culture. One built on formation, on shared experience, on years of immersion in a worldview that prizes influence over recognition, and so the narrative remains steady, even when it appears to shift, even when it critiques power, even when it rebels. Because the frame never changes. You can question religion, you can challenge authority, you can even explore the occult, the forbidden, the hidden. As long as you don't ask why certain truths always seem just out of reach, that's the mastery. Not suppression, but saturation. Flood the world with so many voices, so many opinions, that the real question gets lost in the noise. And in that noise, the Jesuits don't need to speak, they just listen, watch, adjust, because the story is still theirs. Not because they tell it, but because they shaped the ones who do. So next time you read the headline, watch the scene, hear the quote that feels just a little too polished. Ask yourself, who taught the person who wrote it? And what questions did they never learn to ask? It had never happened before. For nearly 5 centuries, the Jesuits had served behind the scenes, advisors, educators, confessors, whisperers, but never the Pope, never the face of the Church, until 2013, when a man in white stepped out onto the Vatican balcony, and underneath that white was the unmistakable shadow of black robes. Pope Francis, the first Jesuit to ascend the throne of St. Peter. The world watched, some cheered, some held their breath. Because for those who understood the order, this wasn't just historic, it was seismic. What would it mean for the most disciplined, strategic, and mysterious order to finally lead the entire church? The Jesuits had always insisted they were not built for the papacy. Their vow of obedience, their mission to serve, meant they should never seek the highest office. And yet, there he stood, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, formed by the exercises, raised in the rhythm of discernment, trained not to lead publicly, but to lead from within, now leading everything. But what changed? At first, everything. A simpler tone, a new focus on poverty, mercy, inclusion. A pope who spoke of the environment with the weight of doctrine, who opened the doors just slightly to conversations long avoided. He moved without the usual armor, spoke without the usual filters. But those who knew the Jesuits recognized the pattern. This wasn't improvisation, it was execution. of a plan long rehearsed, a philosophy finally given a stage. Jesuits do not act quickly, they act precisely. So Francis's gestures, his informal language, his public humility, were not the acts of a rogue leader, they were the language of the exercises, the spiritual strategy of identifying the mood of the moment and becoming the answer it needs. But beneath the compassion, something else stirred. Tensions with traditionalists, clashes with curial insiders, whispers of reform that went deeper than doctrine. Some said he was softening the church, others said he was transforming it, but very few asked whether he was revealing what the church had already become. The ex-priest once said, "A Jesuit doesn't change the system, he reveals its hidden logic." And that's what Pope Francis did. He brought the hidden logic to the surface, the mercy, the adaptation, the silence that holds the contradiction without resolving it. He didn't answer every question, he asked new ones, and in doing so he shifted the center, subtly, irrevocably. But did the Jesuits now run the Vatican? Did power truly shift from the visible to the shadowed? Or had it always lived in the shadow, waiting for the moment when light could finally fall without revealing too much? Because in many ways nothing changed. The old structures remain, the doctrines still stand, the archives stay locked. But now, the man at the center knows exactly what lies behind those doors, because he was trained to guard them, and perhaps when the time comes to open them. So the world applauds the Pope who smiles, who breaks with tradition, who speaks plainly. But behind that smile is a mind trained in layers, in spiritual combat, in discernment, in delay. He is not a politician. He is not a prophet. He is a Jesuit, and Jesuits never show you everything at once. Not all wars are waged with armies. Some are fought in silence, in corridors, in glances exchanged across polished marble floors. Inside the Vatican, a quiet war simmers, one that never makes headlines, but leaves tremors in every decree, every appointment, every delayed decision. It is the war between tradition and transformation, and at the heart of it stand the Jesuits. For centuries, the Church was ruled by a certain kind of man, clerics raised in privilege, groomed in orthodoxy, faithful to ritual, to hierarchy, to the old architecture of power. Their strength came from stability, their language, Latin, their mission, preservation. They were the Vatican elite, and they believed they were defending the Church from the chaos of the world. But the Jesuits have always spoken a different dialect: adaptation, subtlety, strategy. They infiltrate where others fortify. They question where others repeat. They serve but never forget the mission beneath the service. And when one of their own became Pope, the balance tilted, not in revolution, but in erosion, small changes, soft gestures, appointments that whispered a new direction. The elite felt it, and they resisted, not with rebellion, with bureaucracy, with delays, with internal sabotage disguised as tradition. The ex-priest called it a chess match played in confessionals. Because the lines aren't always visible, the battles are rarely spoken, but they are felt. Jesuits promoted to key positions and then quietly blocked, documents drafted and then mysteriously lost, meetings scheduled then postponed indefinitely. It's not insubordination, it's containment. A system trying to defend itself against the agents of change it once invited in as advisors. Now the advisors sit on the throne, and the old guard doesn't know whether to kneel or to wait for the fall. They accuse the Jesuits of softening doctrine, of inviting confusion, of playing too loose with truth. The Jesuits accuse them of clinging to power, of worshipping tradition more than Christ, of fearing reform because it would reveal how much has already changed. Both believe they are saving the Church, but they are saving different versions of it. One sees salvation in the repetition of the past. The other sees it in the careful, silent redesign of the future. And while the world watches papal speeches and Sunday Mass, this internal struggle continues, a war of files, of whispered warnings, of subtle threats made with smiles. No swords, only pens, only placement, only silence, used like a scalpel. And in that silence the Jesuits thrive. because they don't need to win outright. They only need to shape the next generation and the one after that. While the old guard fights to preserve the now, the Jesuits invest in the inevitable. They don't argue loudly, they teach, they form, they wait, and in that waiting, they expand, patiently, unseen. So the war within the church is not about heresy, it's about direction, about who controls the compass when the storms come. And the Jesuits? They've always known how to navigate the dark, even when they are the ones being hunted by the very light they once lit. They were missionaries, explorers, ambassadors of Christ. At least that's what the world was told. But behind the holy robes and the soft-spoken Latin, the Jesuits were collectors, not of wealth, not of territory, of knowledge. From the moment they set foot on foreign soil, whether in the mountains of Peru, the temples of China, or the forests of the Congo, they did not just preach. They observed, they listened, they recorded, and slowly they took. But what they gathered wasn't always material. It was something far more valuable, something invisible, beliefs, practices, myths older than the Gospels, stories passed down by firelight long before Rome was ever founded. They studied rituals that mapped the stars without telescopes. They heard creation myths that echoed Genesis, but predated it. They were shown symbols that mirrored Catholic iconography, but came from civilizations the Church had no record of. And instead of dismissing them, they wrote them down, meticulously. The Jesuits were not like other missionaries. They did not destroy temples. They measured them. They did not burn every scroll. They translated some. They memorized others, then quietly sent reports back to Rome, not to be published, to be archived. The ex-priest once said, the Jesuits carried two books, one they taught from and one they never showed. Because what they learned in those distant lands didn't just challenge Christian theology, it threatened to rewrite it. So they gathered the fragments and brought them home. But the world never saw them again, in hidden drawers of Jesuit colleges, in sealed chambers beneath chapels, in Vatican archives marked classified, they remain. A map of knowledge never assembled in one place before. Aztec cosmology, Chinese divination systems, Indian texts on the soul's journey, African oral traditions that mirror the book of Revelation word for word, but in a tongue never written down. Did the Jesuits believe these truths were demonic? Or did they see a deeper pattern? Something that connected everything, and a single code woven through every ancient culture, a voice that echoed in different names, different rituals, but one source. And maybe they were afraid of what would happen if that truth was spoken aloud. Because unity would threaten control, revelation would dissolve doctrine, so they kept it, not to erase, but to contain. Knowledge is power, but too much power in the wrong hands is chaos. And the Jesuits were never afraid of knowledge. They were afraid of timing, so they waited, and they hid. They built their own library, scattered, protected, whispered between generations. Not digital, not searchable, encoded in ritual, in silence. And now those secrets remain where only the initiated can reach them. Not locked in vaults, but in memory. In the disciplined minds of men trained to remember what the world was never meant to know. So when we ask what the Jesuits took with them, the answer is not gold or relics or statues. It is the thread that binds all myths, all religions, all civilizations. The piece of the puzzle that completes the picture but reveals too much, too soon. And so it remains hidden, not because it is false, but because it is too true. He doesn't sit on the balcony, he doesn't wave to crowds, he's not carried on golden chairs or flanked by cardinals in crimson, but his shadow falls over everything. They call him the Black Pope, not for his skin but for his robe, his silence, his power, the superior general of the Society of Jesus, a title that whispers through history with more weight than most are willing to admit. Publicly he serves, advises, supports the Pope like a loyal general, but quietly, he does something else. He steers. Because while the white Pope blesses, the Black Pope plans. While one speaks of mercy, the other ensures the continuity of power. And perhaps that's the true purpose of the society. to preserve the church when even the papacy is uncertain, to guard the structure even if the face must sometimes change. Some say the Black Pope is symbolic, a servant, nothing more. But symbols have power, and when they're protected for 5 centuries, when they're never questioned, never openly challenged, they stop being just symbols, they become anchors. The ex-priest once said, belief needs a face, but behind that face is always a mechanism. And that's what the Black Pope represents. Not faith, mechanism. The logic of the church, the network, the memory. He is not elected by the masses, he does not answer to bishops. He is chosen by men trained to obey, to protect the mission above all else. And once chosen, he commands the largest religious intelligence network on earth. He oversees education, strategy, diplomacy, information. He knows which truths cannot be told yet, which leaders can be trusted, which pressures must be applied to shift entire nations. And still, he is invisible. Most people don't know his name. And that's not an accident, because power, real power, is never loud. It is patient, structured, like the exercises themselves. Built to last, to endure popes who rise and fall, movements that flare and fade, crises that shake but never collapse. And perhaps that's the answer. The Pope leads the Church, but the Black Pope preserves it, not through theology, through control, of minds, of messages, of history itself. He decides what is remembered, what is forbidden, what is delayed. He is the whisper behind the throne, the final filter through which belief must pass, not to be judged, to be refined. And if the church is the body, he is the spine, quiet, strong, unseen, but without it, everything falls. So when we ask if the Black Pope is merely symbolic, we reveal we haven't been watching closely. Because symbols don't move armies, they don't silence books, they don't place advisors inside every institution. Men do, men trained not to hesitate, not to question, but to execute a centuries-old design. And that design still hums beneath every ritual, every homily, every televised blessing. It's the sound of a face behind the curtain, watching, not with suspicion, with purpose. Because in the end, belief may come from the heart, but it is shaped by the hand you never see. There are thrones we see, and thrones we sense. Cathedrals gleam in daylight, sunlight catching on gold leaf and stained glass. The faithful gather, the cameras roll, the rituals unfold. But beneath the marble, beneath the silence, something else waits. A kingdom in shadow. It does not bear its crest on flags. It does not ask for devotion. It does not declare its existence. And yet, its influence moves through every sermon, every edit in the official catechism, every decision whispered in the ears of men who think they lead. At the heart of that kingdom stands no monarch in white, no emperor with jeweled rings, only a man in black, whose name few know, whose voice is seldom heard, whose face avoids the lens, not out of fear, but discipline. The Black Pope, a title shrouded in myth, dismissed by some as dramatic, inflated by conspiracy, and yet the silence around him speaks louder than denial. For centuries he has led the Society of Jesus, an order founded not for ceremony, but for action. He commands no army, yet his men have stood beside kings within courts beneath altars. He wields no crown, yet his counsel bends the wills of those who do. And unlike the papacy, his power does not require applause. It does not seek blessing. It does not wait for the people's embrace. Because real power doesn't ask for permission. It moves in layers, through memory, through architecture, through minds formed not by force but by formation. And in that stillness, that unwavering structure, the kingdom persists. When popes die, it remains. When scandals erupt, it remains. When belief fractures, when churches empty, it waits, unafraid, undiminished. Because this kingdom was never built on public trust. It was built on discipline, obedience, and a vision too vast to be entrusted to a single generation. The ex-priest once said, "They don't fear being forgotten. They were designed to be unseen." And perhaps that's the final truth. The Jesuits didn't come to rule the church, they came to guard it, to hold the map even when the hands that steer the ship forget the stars. They came to speak only when silence was no longer enough. And in that mission, the Black Pope remains, not to be admired, not to be worshipped, but to ensure that what must endure does. Even if it costs visibility, even if it means letting others wear the crown, because some kingdoms are carved in stone, some are carved in minds, but the rarest, the most dangerous are carved in time, built so deep that even history can't erase them. So when you walk past a church, when you hear the hymns, when you see the news about doctrines debated, popes questioned, institutions shaken, remember this. The face may change, the voice may falter, but somewhere in the space behind all things the design remains. Not because it's holy, not because it's right, but because it was built to last. And the man who holds that design does not need your belief. He already has your attention, even if you never knew he was there. If you're still here, then you already know. You felt it. That pull behind the words, the silence between the lines, the faint hum beneath the surface where truth hides in plain sight. We didn't offer answers tonight. We offered questions, wounds in the timeline, cracks in the stained glass. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply ask what was never meant to be asked. So if this story stirred something in you, something unspoken, something forgotten, or maybe something you've always suspected, don't let it fade. Let it echo. Subscribe. Not to follow, but to continue. To stay tethered to this strange unfolding we're all part of. Leave a comment below. What resonated? What unsettled you? What do you think they still aren't telling us? We read every word, not just to grow, but to listen. To build a place where curiosity is sacred and silence is sometimes broken with purpose, like this video. Share it with someone who still believes there's nothing behind the curtain. And if you haven't already, subscribe, not for entertainment, but for continuity, for truth that unfolds one layer at a time, because this isn't just a channel, it's a corridor, a quiet rebellion, a map back to the questions they told us not to ask. This is history for sleep, where the lights dim, but the mind wakes up. Good night, and never stop wondering what lies beneath.